Our first panelist is Professor Jeff Halper, who is the director of Israeli Committee Against House Demolition, and he will talk about his paper called Challenging the Matrix of Control and House Demolition. Jeff, the floor is
yours. Okay, it's good to be here. It's actually not true. I'm not going to talk about the matrix of control or house. In order to explain why Gaza is happening. You know, I think what's been really great about these last couple days with the tribunal is that the people span, you know, from the purely academic to academic, you know, with very much of a political focus to try to contribute some academic analysis to the understanding of what's happening. You know, Phyllis talked about the role of civil society yesterday, and I'm sort of that other end of the spectrum, and that is I'm an academic, an engaged anthropologist, who's very much involved in the, I'm not at the university anymore. I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, and very much involved in the political process of trying to come to a resolution of all of this, not only protest and analyze and resist and so on, but also, you know, I'm also a member of a Palestinian-led group called the One Democratic State Campaign. So what I want to do today is kind of something, I'm not going to say anything you don't know. And Penny's analysis of genocide, you know, is much more detailed than what I'm going to present. What I'm going to present is what I kind of present to the public, because advocacy is very important. If civil society, you know, it's not enough. I don't completely agree with Phyllis, actually. It's not enough to mobilize civil society. Civil society has to be mobilized in a way that is focused, that it knows what the problem is, that it can advocate in the halls of power or on the media, you know, in an articulate way. Not only that we're against this or this, but they have to be able to articulate what the issue is. And at the same time, and this is really what's lacking, we have to have a political program. I'm not going to talk about that today, but that's, you know, all this is going towards, you know, to what end? The question really has to be to what end. So what I want to do is just show you a little bit how I would explain Gaza, and in a sense, try to get people to understand the logic. If we can get them to understand the logic, then they get it. And now they can, when new things happen in Gaza, there's new news, there's a new development, somebody says something, they're able to plug that in because they get the logic of what's going on in terms of Zionist settler colonialism. So where I only have a few minutes, so I can't really go into detail. Where I begin is we can't use the term, we should stop using the term conflict. And what's been very gratifying the last 2 days is I don't think I've heard the word conflict. So we're all aware of that. That it's the wrong framing, it's a destructive framing because it creates this false symmetry between the colonizer and the colonized. And of course it has its own logic and its own dynamic that leads to two-state solutions and other kinds of unjust and unworkable ideas. But rather I try to name exactly what we're engaged in that I frame as a struggle against Zionist settler colonialism. And then I see the settler colonial movement as having four, I mean, there's all kinds of ways to present it. I mean, there's 6 phases and there's, you know, everybody has an analysis, but, and they all fit in together. But, you know, to help people understand it in kind of a more, not simplistic way, but in a way that they can use it, especially if we're talking to people that aren't academics, I say there's 4 stages of Zionist settler colonialism. The first stage is unilateral invasion and settlement. And the unilateral part is very important because, again, conflict begins to assume 2 sides. There's 2 sides, and the sides have to negotiate. And what the conflict model does, of course, is it elevates Zionism to a legitimate side, where, as we all know, colonialism is never legitimate. It's always illegal, immoral, unjust. And to elevate it to a side is a historical injustice and certainly unhelpful politically, and at the same time making the Palestinian people, indigenous people living in their country, a side that now has to somehow compromise and defend its right even to be in the country is of course, unacceptable. So to emphasize settler colonialism is unilateral, and in many ways the Palestinians are irrelevant to it. The Zionists had their own agenda. As Elon said, it was a European project, and they came in to take over the land. And so you can see even in the pattern of Zionist settlement before 1948, you already begin to see the modern map of Israel and the West Bank beginning to emerge at that time. The second stage of settler colonialism is, of course, the transformation of an Arab country into a Jewish country. And here, as Penny's talked about in many cases how the legal system and legal terminology is inadequate. And I think here is a good case of that. The best term, it is a term we almost never use and never hear, for capturing the essence of what Zionism is all about, what the settler colonial project is all about, is Judaization. And it's a term that the Zionist movement used. It's a term that's used officially today. We're Judaizing the Galilee. We're Judaizing Jerusalem. We're Judaizing Palestine. That term is especially important because it captures more than any other term I know exactly what the purpose of Zionism and what the goal of Zionism is. So if you're going to explain particular events like, or processes like Gaza, or like settler colonialism, or where Israel is going, or how can we resolve this, if you don't understand the concept of Judaization as the basis of it, you don't get it. I don't think any other term gives that comprehensive understanding of where exactly this whole what this whole project is and where it's going. And of course, the flip side of Judaization is de-Arabization. And you can see very much the process, I mean, we all know this, the process of Judaization, of transforming an Arab country into a Jewish country. And of course, this is all, it continues today. Here's the map of already the plan for resettling Gaza, that the settlers have developed. Now, the fourth phase, now, I know I skipped the third, and I skipped the third in a way for a reason, not in a way, I skipped it for a reason, that I'll come back to in a second. The end game of settler colonialism is normalization. In other words, this is another term that we almost never hear. Certainly you're not going to go mobilize masses of people in the streets of London around normalization. It's a gray, dry, academic-sounding term, but it's tremendously important. It's no less important. I would say Judaization and normalization are the bookends of understanding settler colonialism. Settler colonialism has an end, and its end is not the defeat of the indigenous population in any dramatic way or any military sense like Gaza. Gaza is a part of the process. Settler colonialism ends almost like the T.S. Eliot poem, not with a bang, but with a whimper. It ends by being normalized. It's just normalized. It becomes, the perception of what reality is. It's on the map. It's the way everybody looks at the country. It's now Israel, and Palestine is erased. So that and normalization is a closure. and that, I think, because I put this within the political context, there's a disconnect between our political work and what's happening on the ground politically. In other words, all the organizations I work with, civil society organizations all over the world, including inside Palestine and Israel, our own organizations, we all have our agendas, we have our timetables, we have our meetings, we have our completely disconnected from what's happening. And you hear all the time, even from Palestinians, this isn't the time to talk politics. I begin many of my talks by apologizing or acknowledging the genocide that's happening, because people say it's inappropriate to talk about a political solution at a time of genocide. First we deal with the genocide, and then we deal with all this other political stuff. But it doesn't work that way. We have to multitask. The world does not stop its political motion just because it doesn't fit our timetable. I was in a meeting of our one Democratic State group a couple days ago where people are talking about, well, maybe in another year we'll declare ourselves a political movement. I mean, there's a complete disconnect. There's an urgency here that somehow is missing in our discussions and so on. Normalization is happening. You know, the Trump plan is going through. This is Netanyahu in the United Nations on the podium of the General Assembly 2 weeks before October 7th, showing the map of the new Middle East, where he was on the cusp of signing with, Saudi Arabia, was on the cusp of entering into the Abraham Accords, the new Middle East, as Elon says, in an unabashed way, Israel presents a greater Israel. It's not hiding anything. The settler colonial project isn't something that's hidden in the dark. It's in our faces. And I think that's also where Israel wins, because if it's able to get Europe and the United States and the Arab countries and others to accept what's actually going on, and not, they don't have to play games either. Everybody's up front in terms of that, and that, I think, is the essence of the normalization project. Normalization means a greater Israel, as you can see on the map, and normalization, of course, means a two-state solution, which is actually two-state apartheid, because Palestinians have to be locked into a little Bantustan on 15% of the country. So normalization is the end, in a way. I mean, we have to really think about this, and this is coming down the pipeline. Because after normalization, there's very little political space left. Palestinians will come and say, well, wait, we're locked in a Bantustan, non-viable state, non-sovereign state, so-called state, and so on. What about our rights? And the world's going to say, hey, we've normalized. It's over. We've moved on to Sudan. We still have Ukraine to deal with. The Palestinian issue is removed from the international agenda. So there's a real urgency and danger, and I think we haven't focused on that part of the settler colonial project. We focus more on how it works, but how it's resolved and how that is being resolved in real time today is something that I think we have to focus on more. And of course, normalization isn't hidden in any kind of a way. Trump presented a plan in 2020 of exactly where he's going with normalization. Since then, there's another couple 100,000 settlers in the West Bank, and Gaza has been destroyed. So this map is probably an optimistic map of what a normalized two-state apartheid would look like. But of course, in this plan of normalization, there's no territorial contiguity for Palestinians, no sovereignty, no economic viability, and of course, the refugees are unable to return. And, when we talk about normalization, pacification, the annihilatory phase of settler colonialism, I mean, it's right in front of us in terms of Gaza. And this is the third part, because pacification has to precede normalization. That's the process. Normalization is stuck today because Saudi Arabia, and MBS says this, MBS said to Blinken, and we all know the quote, I don't care about the Palestinians, but I have a younger generation that does. So what the Arab governments need, and especially Saudi Arabia, is a period of industrial quiet before it's able to enter into a normalization agreement with this greater Israel. And that's the stage. That explains Gaza, from my point of view. Genocide, as many people have emphasized, is a process. And it began from the very beginning of the settler colonial project. Genocide is built into settler colonialism, as we all know. And it's had its more violent, vicious, intense periods, and its more quiescent periods where it goes on, but sort of under the radar and in less violent ways, maybe like settlement and so on. Why is it culminating today? Why do we have Gaza today? And the Gazification of the West Bank, let's not forget that, because of the normalization process. We can't disconnect our analysis from the political processes. Settler colonialism isn't only a process where we can name the different phases. The phases have a timetable. The phases take certain forms according to how close we're getting to the culmination of it all, which is normalization. And that, I think, explains Gaza today and the West Bank. And that is that as Israel has this opportunity with Trump to normalize, it's got to break the Palestinian resistance forever, right? And it has to introduce this period of industrial quiet that will then pave the way for and enable the normalization process to take place. You have Rafah, you've got the West Bank, the refugee camps, you've got the ethnic cleansing. I actually sent another PowerPoint, but it doesn't matter. And so that, I think, is begins to explain Gaza within the context of not only the process of settler colonialism and the resistance to it, but also in the context of the political process of normalization that we're in today. So if I would, just at the end, kind of summarize where we are in the struggle for Palestinian liberation against settler colonialism, we're really towards the end here. In other words, what Penny has mentioned as the annihilatory phase of settler colonialism, the pacification, the breaking of resistance, and so on, were there. And then moving into the last phase, which is normalization, and then you've got this conclusion of the settler colonial project, I think. On the other hand, of course, and I don't have time to talk about this, you've got the Palestinian resistance that also develops and organizes as the settler colonial project begins. We can't focus only on the settler colonial project, on its own. We have to look at how it's reacting to Palestinian resistance and how Palestinian resistance is reacting to the settler colonial project. And I think we're at the stage now, and this I go back to the point I made before, where resistance has been strong all these years. We've had the resistance in Gaza the last couple of years, in the refugee camps now. Resistance takes different forms. But at some point, there's got to be a political program. There cannot be, you can't be in a political struggle without a political program. And without a political program, we're unable to summon power. The Palestinians, I believe, have the ability to summon the power to effectively fight against the settler colonial project. We see the mobilization of the world for Palestinians, but what they're lacking is the summoning of power. And in some ways, the resistance has kind of been left alone. I mean, here the resistance is going on, but our side of it, the academics, the intellectuals, the political people, those that can take the resistance and move it into a political program and become political actors, we're falling down on the game. We are not picking up our end of the struggle, I think. And that's the problem. So whether the Palestinians summon power and what the political program will be, that has to be a political program that addresses the logic of settler colonialism, we'll see. But this, I think, is where we are today. So I'll leave it at that. And